fáilte go dtí an episód sa Cheis na Tangan. Podcréil faoi Nghaoileán agus a star de aine atá fistrucht faoi our gadrúh léithí agus a role in our bhéiniúlacht. Welcome to The Language Question, a podcast about the Irish language and its history for anyone curious about our relationship with it and its role in our identity. Maras Gnách, bí cinnte a chlárú ag thelanguagequestion.com/resources chun de acmhaní fálam to séar an aisce a fháil agus a bheith ar an eolas faoi gachród atá ar siúl ar an show. As usual, please be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to be sure to get your complimentary, valuable learning resources and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests, and to receive exclusive content. Peish Gele, Shulling, Gomwena tú soltas. Anyhow, here goes. I hope you enjoy it.
Dian Killian is an award-winning writer, musician, and singer-songwriter. Irish studies have been a lifelong passion, and her MPhil was in Anglo-Irish literature in cultural historical contexts. Her PhD culminated in research on the nation's other, the construction of Irish national identity in the context of British colonialism and immigration. She is a non-violent communication trainer, and she is the founder and author of the hugely popular Substack publication entitled The Gaelic Effect. Again, Akara, tá fáilte is fiche rót, agus tá Harabeh buíocht as a bheith líon ar an show.
Go míle maith and for inviting me.
Dian, there's so much I want to get into, but what I would like to do to begin with, as I like to do with all of our guests here, is if you would just a little bit of your background, where you're coming from in relation to, your Irish language experience. And so would you mind just telling us, just in terms of your background, where you came from originally and how you came to here and where your interest in the Irish language came from?
I'm from New York originally, so raised in the US. And despite my last name, I was not raised at all as an Irish American. I had no connection with any. I'm actually a very small part of my background. I'm a bit of a mutt, like a lot of Americans. So, if you look at my DNA test, it's a bit all over the map. But anyway, the point is, I wasn't raised Irish American, and I just on a whim came to Ireland when I was 20 and just absolutely fell in love. I just couldn't believe. And it was so different from what I expected. I think I had a really distorted idea of what Ireland would be like based on my experiences of Irish Americans in the United States. And, not to go down too much of a rabbit hole, and this dates me a little bit, but I grew up, I was around 10, 11, 12 years old when the busing riots were happening in Boston, for example. When I would see St. Patrick's Day Parade, I would see green bagels, green beer. It didn't connect me with the heart or soul at all of Irish culture. And I'm even getting tingles, if it chills, when I'm talking to you about this. When I first came to Ireland, something just hit me on a very somatic level about the land, about the language here, even how the English language is spoken, which obviously, Hiberno English would not be what it is without the Irish language. I loved my course at Trinity. My main complaint about that course at Trinity is it was so broad, in terms of socio-historical context. We did read Irish works in translation, like Peg, for example, some things from Miles Nagopleen, but that we weren't required to learn any Irish at all. I now find shocking because once you start to learn Irish, it gives you such an insight in how the English language is spoken here. And I had an idea of that, but there's no substitute for actually learning Antianga to really get that. But by the way, as I told you when you invited me, I'm not at all fluent in Irish. It's Gaeilgeoir Beag. I'm a baby Gaeilgeoir, so I'll...
Well. I mean, I think you're very, very modest, but that's even better again. Frankly, Dian, because one of the things that I find here is some of the feedback we get from people listening to the show, and the reason that the podcast is Asperla is to provide people who are interested in the language, maybe learning the language, but not yet able to access Radi na Gaeltachta or the more kind of advanced sources directly, to give them an opportunity to access this language that they're so interested in, but maybe not yet able to do it directly in the language itself. And also, I think, and this is why I'm so grateful to you for being with us, is to be able to see themselves, and you're a wonderful example of that, I think, for learners And that's what I want to kind of just dig into. But let me just bring it back. You came in when you were 20. And did you pursue kind of your kind of undergraduate study here then, or?
Well, I was just finishing up my undergraduate degree at Rutgers in English with a minor in history. Although most of my studies was not in literature, I ended up doing more things on like applied linguistics, theory of English grammar. Being in a department of English, I was required to do some literature courses. But I just mentioned that up front because, it's been a lifelong passion for me, just language itself and how it works and how language impacts our thinking and how we see the world. I came to Ireland when I was 20, immediately fell in love. I had the gra, and I love that in a way because I don't have this clear Irish connection. In a sense, it sounds maybe a little odd to say it's pure, but I didn't have any reason to fall in love with Ireland. Although I'll tell you an interesting backstory if anyone believes in this, maybe you don't and find it a bit, woo-woo, but I once met someone in the States who was a spiritualist. She hadn't met me before. I was at an event. She literally was walking past me in an aisle, and the woman looked like she was going to faint. And I said, "Are you okay?" Like, I hadn't even said hello to her yet. "Are you okay?" And she says, "But you've had so many past lives in Ireland, and they're hitting me one after another. And there's so many of them, it's overwhelming for me." And she hadn't even met me yet. And I was like, wow. I said to her, "You have no idea how deep that is, in terms of my life experience." But it's interesting. That matches what it was like when I first came here. It was like, I didn't know a place like this existed. I'm kind of tearing up saying this. I feel like this is my home. Like, I just knew it was my home as soon as I came here. And partly, I am tearing up. Partly it's because there's so much about Irish culture that just happens to resonate with me. Like a love of language, a love of music. I was already a traditional, musician. And so, an ceol, an teanga, just the nature, the connection with land, all of these things deeply spoke to me. And also just, it's a bit of a cliche, but there's reality to it. The Irish, I still believe, are exceptionally friendly and welcoming as a people and as a culture. And that's a whole other story if you want to hear it. But I met this Irish couple. I was studying French that summer in France. And I took the boat over from Le Havre to Rosslare. And I met an Irish couple on the boat. And we just hit it off. And they offered to give me a lift to Dublin. And by the time I got to Dublin, I was going to stay at the youth hostel. And they went, "Oh, no, you're not going to stay at the hostel. Stay at our house." I don't know where else that would happen in the world. There's probably somewhere, but I'd never experienced it before. And so I was here a week and I went down to Kerry, completely fell in love with Dingle, which is one reason, and all of Kerry. And I also love Cork. So I know there's a rivalry between Cork and Kerry. I don't want to get into that myself. I love...
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit, which to me is not coming from those counties or Ireland is amusing because they're neighbours and they're my two favourite counties. And I just love Munster and I love Gaelin. So I'm living in Leinster, so it's hard not to learn other dialects. But, I've been going down to Ballyferret, it'll be my fourth summer to study Irish there. And when I was in New York, I actually studied a bit of Irish with someone who was teaching Gaelin, which is the Munster dialect. So that kind of started with that first trip when I went down and was like just blown away. I'd never seen the landscape that you see like on Slayhead with like mountains just dropping into the ocean and these colors that look like they're in Technicolor, but they're real, I said to these new friends, I said, I love it here. I said, I'm going to move here. And they were like, yeah. So I went back to the States. I applied. It was my last year at uni. At Rutgers. So I applied to UCD and Trinity to do postgraduate programs. And it's funny, I never heard from UCD. I don't know why. Never got heard from them, but I did get a place at Trinity in this program that I loved, which you mentioned in the intro, a Master of Philosophy program in Anglo-Irish literature and socio-historical context. So to go back to your question, let me know, Finine, and I'll come back.
Keep going.
Okay. So while I was at Trinity, they have a language lab there. At least they did. This is Fado, a long time ago, decades ago. So I had enough sense even then to try to learn a little Irish. But the program was so demanding. I once decided to add up, if you looked at all the books on the reading list in that 1 year program, well, by the time you do your thesis, it was 18 months. But when you add up all of the books, it averaged out to 2,000 pages a week that you're expected to read. Now, obviously, no one can read 2,000 pages a week. So that's my excuse for that. At that point, that I didn't keep up, with Django. I did start learning Irish then. And to be honest, my first impression was like, whoa, like this is difficult, which, I think some people do have that first impression of Irish. I actually don't believe that anymore. I actually think, and having a background in teaching English as a second language, when you think about English has 200 irregular verbs, just put your brain around that for a second. I mean, I'm lucky in a sense that it's such a dominant language in the world, and I was lucky enough to grow up with it being my first language. But, I think Irish has 13 irregular verbs, So
yeah, 11, I think.
11, yeah. So that's a huge difference. And then also, when I first started learning, I would give out about pronunciation in Irish. You think you learn a word, but then there's this thing called a shevu, and that changes the pronunciation of the word, and other words around it change it. But really, once you get your brain around pronunciation in Irish, it is so consistent. I have a certificate in teaching English as a second language from the Princeton and Asia program at Princeton University. And I taught English as a second language for many years, even designed a program for graduate teaching assistants in the States. But the point is, the pronunciation in English is so inconsistent. I don't know how anyone learns the language, honestly, except that we're just inundated with it, like so many films and music. So that's of course, when you can get complete immersion in a language, it makes it easier to learn it. But I mean, English is what I call a bastard language. And I'm a little sad to say this, because it's my first language. And I for years, and as my first language, I've had a love affair with it, because it's how I've seen the world and experienced the world. But it's interesting that it's a bastard language. My point is about pronunciation. It is a German language, so structurally it's German. It's like Plattdeutsch. It's a low form of German. But because of the Norman invasion in England, there was influx of French. So that is one reason pronunciation is very inconsistent in English, because they come from two different language groups. Obviously any language, you look at Irish, it has had influence from other languages, because that's just the way the world is. Like the word sushi, who's going to make up a new word for sushi? It's a Japanese word. So, or yoga. So in any language you have foreign words that are brought into the language. But I mean, Irish has a very clear lineage. It's not a bastard language in the sense that it's come from this mix-up of languages, which impacts pronunciation in English.
I think we do run up against this as Irish people and many of people of Irish descent who are interested in the language and who listen here, who are, their first language is English. And I think the biggest problem we have learning Irish often is it's not English. And you think, oh, well, if English is intuitive and therefore anything that doesn't fit into that kind of model of language is difficult or weird or unusual. But I want to come to that because I'm very interested in your learning experience. And I think that's very, very important. But I'd like just before we get to that, I'd like to, because you took a very particular path that I find fascinating and very important down, first of all, Anglo-Irish literature, and then in terms of a PhD, you went into this area of the construction of Irish national identity in the context of British colonialism and immigration. And I mention that because there is a very popular kind of, I'm not sure what the correct word for it is, but field or just kind of idea at the moment around the decolonization of language and so on. And a lot of people will refer to Ngugi Waithongo's book, the decolonizing the mind and so on, and seeing that as
which Manchon McGon used a lot, which I loved how he talked about, rewilding
the mind. Yeah. It's such a cool concept. But can you just give me, before we dig into Irish as a language and learning that, but just that whole, because that's something obviously you have a very deep kind of, knowledge and academic experience of having spent time in that. But can you give us a little bit of insight there as to how you got led into that kind of field of study?
Well, while I was a student here at Trinity for, about 18 months, that was in the late 80s. And at that time, I heard a statistic about, and obviously I knew just living here that there were massive waves of emigration out of Ireland at that point. So many undocumented Irish living in New York, Boston, all over the US, but especially those traditionally Irish cities. But I saw a statistic that the annual birth rate, I think it was 1988 maybe, maybe 86, but around that period. Actually, now that I think about it, it must have been earlier. When I was at Trinity. It's probably 1985. But anyway, the annual birth rate in Ireland was at the same level as the annual emigration rate. And that led me to start thinking like, wow, how does a country like live with that, metabolize it? How do you make peace with it or not make peace with it? Especially knowing at that point a bit of Irish history that, that it had been colonized for 800 years. And if you look at the language around, the whole Republican movement in Ireland, not the only piece, a lot of it was our four green fields. And yes, we want our land back. We want our culture. But also part of the discourse was around stopping the massive waves of immigration, which of course in Irish history have paralleled other huge tragedies here, like the Great Famine. So that's how I became interested in, because I had a background in critical and narrative theory and cultural studies. I brought that lens in. And if you're not familiar with that, that's basically using the tools that anyone would learn if you're studying literature, like doing a close reading of a text, but using that to do a close reading of culture. So, for example, my PhD, one of the cultural studies courses I did, the assignment was to do a close reading of high heels. What do high heels mean in the culture? Which is, by the way, interesting in itself. But if that gives you an idea. So I was interested in text in a very broad way. So in my PhD dissertation, I looked at advertisements. I looked at government documents. I did look at literature as well. I looked at films. And what I found really disturbing after doing all this research, and again, I get chills talking about this, I actually had in my dissertation parallel tracks, one's produced by the British government, like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then documents that the Republic of Ireland. What I found unnerving is it's almost like the Irish government had copied the British documents. They were so similar in terms of how emigration was justified. In my opinion, there's never sufficient justification for emigration, especially the levels that have occurred in Ireland. And there's a huge amount of trauma around that. I mean, there's so much collective trauma in Ireland. I'll talk about this as well, connected to the famine. It wasn't that long ago, the Great Famine, really, if you think about it. But 800 years of colonialism, then all of the trauma connected to the Irish language. But then there's this whole other collective trauma, and all of this intersects because, would massive waves of emigration happen without famine, without colonialism? They're all intimately connected. But that is such a part of the culture. And when you looked at the discourse that the Irish government was using, a lot of it was just justification around how, we're a small island and people want to travel and see the world. That's just total shite. Yes, there's always a certain number of people who want to travel, and then they might also want to come home. But what is it, and was it, but still in Irish culture? Now it's kind of a cultural tradition for people to leave. But there's a huge amount of pain connected to that. And to give you one sample of how I connected with that pain is I actually did a series of oral history interviews with Irish immigrants in the United States as part of this project. One of the theorists that I draw on my PhD dissertation is a Russian theorist, but he talked about dual discourse in texts and how there's a dominant discourse. Between the lines, you can hear, if you listen for it, sort of the non-dominant discourse that's in relationship with that discourse. So I was curious, how does that turn up in this context? So I really saw this in the oral history narratives that I collected. And I would usually, or sometimes at least, go and talk to the immigrants more than once. And the first time I interviewed one immigrant was so clear, but it happened in some form with multiple people. She gave, in my opinion, the dominant discourse. She emigrated to the U.S. in the 1950s. Her father had died. Her mother remarried. The stepfather was not very kind to her. So she left Ireland at 16 years old. And she, in effect, gave me the dominant discourse, it was for the best for everybody. Someone from the family had to go, but look, now I've got all this in the United States. Like, in effect, it's a justification. And I just listened because it's an oral history narrative. I went back with the second interview. In the second interview, that's when all the pain came out. Once she had shared the dominant discourse, and I came back a second time. Then she talked about how hard it was, how lonely she was, how scared she was, how much she still missed Ireland, So it's very complex. There's a lot there. But again, all of this is really the same ball of wax. And the question that I would ask out of my love for the Irish people and Irish culture is, and I don't have the exact answer to this, but I think the language is part of the answer, is what does it look like to heal hundreds of years of trauma? And obviously, Ireland is not the only country and culture that's experienced trauma collectively in the world, but it's one of the cultures that I know best where I can see that. I mean, there's trauma in the United States as well of a different kind to do with indigenous people, slavery. By the way, that has not been addressed sufficiently in the United States either. That's all the rabbit hole. I don't think we'd be in the situation we're in the United States right now politically if those issues had been addressed, by the way. Because trauma that's unaddressed, it's like the Loch Ness Monster. Like the analogy I give, it's a beautiful sunny day, you're out on Loch Ness, rowing your boat, you're going to have a picnic, all of a sudden, whoa, what's that? Something bumps, almost pushes you out of the boat. Because it's in the unconscious. 97% of our brains function on an unconscious level. 97%.
Yeah, because that's immediately what you described there in terms of that interaction with those immigrants reminds me immediately of Nuala O'Neill's mermaid poems and how she, that whole sense of people having lost this ability to understand the world and how they just don't even have the words to describe what they've lost. But and again, of course, that whole question of immigration, because it disproportionately impacted in Gaeltacht areas, and we still have the same thing today. Just before we even went on air, we were speaking about the housing crisis is kind of a current manifestation of all of that, and that, of course, is a doubly difficult situation in the Gaeltacht, and the housing crisis there is essentially, a serious threat to the survival of the language there. So I think everything that you've done there is really fascinating, and it sets it up beautifully, I think, as to why you are such a passionate, advocate for the language now and everything that you're doing. And that's what I want to come on to really in terms of, because the way I first became aware of you was through what you do on Substack with the Gaelic Effect and so on. But before getting to that, can we just talk about, okay, so you came here, you studied here, you got very seriously interested in the academic study of the culture, the literature, and so on. How did that then morph into your learning of the language? What does that look like for you over the last number of years?
So when I moved back to New York City, I did for a brief time study Irish again with a teacher from Munster who's teaching Gaelan. But again, Tan scale Bronach, Tor Bronor, I'm sad about this. I didn't keep up with it. Life keeps happening. My Irish would be way better than it is now if I was more structured around studying. Like the people who study every day, and I was doing that for a while, fell off the wagon, I want to get back onto it. Like, there's no substitute for it. You can go to the Gaeltacht every summer like I do. I do an Irish course. I'm doing different Irish courses, but if you don't study, you're not going to learn. Clacta. Practice. That is the reality of learning a language. So, but anyway, I studied it more there and also loved it. But it wasn't until about 3 years ago where I really started learning it and pushed through my judgments, because I did have that initial judgment like, oh, this is too weird. This is too difficult. Tasha Jacker, this is difficult. But here's the interesting thing, and I don't know how many of my Substacks you've had a chance to read. I talk about this in earlier ones. I find when I push through, the areas where I have resistance around the Irish language are often the most beautiful and fascinating parts of the language. Like, for example, when I first realized, when it hit me, whoa, prepositions conjugate in Irish. My first thought was like, That's just too weird. That's too strange. Now, by the way, I am a grammar geek, just to include everybody. The most standard thing, if you look at languages statistically, I don't have a number right here on the top of my head, but most languages, not all of them, but most of them, the verbs conjugate. So, in English, I go, you go, he, she, it goes. By the way, a lot of verbs in English don't conjugate that much, but they do change. And we have 12 different verb tenses in English. French is a lot more, by the way. That's a huge range, By the way, the first two Substacks that I wrote about were really about how learning any language breaks your brain open. Because when I first started learning French, that was my first inkling, like, wow, this is not just like fill in the blanks. There's some things in languages that work that way. But once you start learning a language, and my breakthrough moment with that with French was my French teacher was teaching us, is it, quote, working? But she was asking, est-ce qu'il marche? And I said, and here me, I'm an 11-year-old learning French, and I was cocky enough to be challenging my teacher. I said, no, you don't mean marche, you mean travail. Is it working? And she said, no, in French, things don't work, they walk. And I decided, as an 11-year-old, I was like, what? I wrote a whole blog about this, one of the first blogs in the series, because I wanted to start out with exploring the concepts about how can learning another language expand, almost blow open your brain and change your thinking. What is the research about how language does actually impact our thinking? And there's more and more research about that. I just do skim that in the third blog. But that was my first moment where I realized wow, I'm not just going to learn how to read and speak French. This is going to change how I see the world. And I got that as an 11-year-old. But to go back to prepositions, and in Irish, most languages, the verbs conjugate. Irish is fairly unusual. Actually, most of the languages that have prepositions that conjugate are in the Irish language groups, so Scots Gaelic, Irish, Welsh, Breton. Anyone who knows a little Irish would know the beautiful thing about that is the verb doesn't change forms. So you could, for example, say, tá chocolate a gum. I have. Literally, that means the chocolate is at me, but that's how you say in Irish, I have chocolate. But if I wanted to say, tá chocolate a gut, you have chocolate, I hope you have some. Chocolate's a great thing. What changes is the preposition. So that is fairly unusual. And when I first learned that, I was like, oh, this is too weird. I don't know. I want to like Irish, it's just too weird. But the more I got into it, I was like, wait, this is the greater erfad. This is incredible because I realize, and again, I get chills talking about this. I believe that Irish culture intrinsically, indigenously, is a highly relational culture. And I think all human beings are, but in other cultures it's been lost more. But you see that relationality in the Irish language because I have a whole blog about this. But in English, if I pick up the pen and I say the pen is on the table, okay, nothing changes much in that sentence. There's the pen, there's the table, the preposition is on, I put it on the table, the preposition doesn't change. And by the way, another amazing thing about the Irish language is it starts with the verb. I'll talk about that in a second. But let's just say the preposition for a second. In English, for example, starts with the subject, then the verb, so it's the agent. I am doing something to this, and I'm putting it somewhere. But in Irish, it's a whole different universe. You are changed as much by the object because of that preposition. It is so relational. I hope this is, you're nodding, so I think you're with me on this, right? I hope this is making sense.
Completely. But I'm fascinated by where you're taking this, yeah.
And if you look at this, I sometimes tell people the Irish language is like a rubric cube, like that old game. You move one piece, move another piece. And it's so funny. I went to Unshackle Lower this week to pick up a few things. I have raffles regularly with at the Gaelic Effect to thank paying subscribers. So I went and got a few things. Anyway, the point is, I was like, I haven't been here for a while. I'm feeling much more confident about my Irish. I can go in and say, Rinne me ordu Erlina, Dian Killian is Adam Dub. I didn't order online. My name's Dian Killian. I was already as excited as going to be using my couple of fucko. And it was so funny. I got in there, and it's kind of the classic moment. I might write about it this week. At the very first moment, I didn't expect this to happen so soon, but the worker was just inside the door, and he said, Dearwood, which is hello. Most people probably know if you know any Irish. And I immediately said, Dearwood back. Now, of course, that's a mistake. So I immediately said, dear Smogut. But that's another example of relationality. Like if you ever start learning Irish and you realize like, wait, by the way, there's other ways to greet people. You can just say, what's the story? What's happening? Or Cunas Tantu, which I'm using Gwaelin, the classic Irish would be Cunas Tantu, but in Munster they say Cunas Tantu. But you can just say someone, how are you? But if you're meeting someone, it's a bit more formal. You haven't met them before, you probably say, dear, what's, that's why I pronounce obviously different dialects. And so here's a moment where the most basic thing in Irish I forgot just coming in the door. And that's that example of relationality as well, because in Irish, you just don't say hello and hello back. There's literally God be with you, Mary be with you, Jesus and Mary be with you. And it's rare that you escalate that much where you have Jesus, Joseph, Bridget, who else are you going to add in there?
You can stick Padraig in there as well if you want to go for it.
Bridget, Yeah. My Irish teacher this term went over it. I don't have it in front of me, but she had like all of the saints in the order they usually come in. And that rarely happens. But the point is, it's part of the language. It's part of the culture and the ethos and the mindset of the language that on one hand you could say you're upping the ante, but I don't see it that way. It's more because there's such a tradition of blessings in the Irish language, bonity. So you want to even give more blessings to the other person, but it's highly relational, like that Rubik cube, because you just can't say hello and hello back. You need to be paying attention, first of all. Who else is coming into the conversation? And so I had this moment of despair. One of the first blogs was like the learning a second language is there's victory and despair, defeat happens regularly. It's just the nature of learning a language.
But I think there as well, I think you just gave us a perfect practical example of that. First of all, that you're showing up on Chipolauer there, looking to buy some resources, and you're starting to use what language you have, and immediately you use it, you say, "Oh goodness, I've made a mistake there." Rather than say, "Oh my goodness, this is the world is over, I've made a mistake," it's like and then there's a self-correction, and this is how we learn is just by letting it all kind of go and get into it. Leaning into the mortification. Yeah, completely.
There's also moments of pure joy. Another blog I spoke about, I was down in Greystones recently, and a woman had 2 dogs, and like passing conversation, said, "Oh, they're excited because they saw a cat." I don't know what possessed me, but all of a sudden I just said, "Oh, call on cot. Where's the cat?" Just came out of my mouth. And then, she said, Tasha and Shaw. So, it was up on the roof of this car. And then she said, safe enough. But then I said to her back, Asquelga, Tashe Simulfas. Do Madra, but it's still interesting for a dog. And then we said Slan, like that totally made my day. Like to be having the couple of fuckles, be speaking a few words of Irish. So I continually chance my arm, even though I'm a baby Gaeilgeoir, I'm going to make mistakes. And by the way, back briefly to that whole trauma question, if you want to see the trauma around the Irish language, just try speaking Irish to people, especially anywhere, but I find especially in Dublin, like the things that people will say in response. Sometimes you get what happened that day in Greystones. Without missing a beat, the woman responded to me, Asquelga. We had our lovely conversation in Irish, which totally made my day. She seemed to be happy about it as well. But then I would say, I don't know what number to put on, at least 60% of the time, what you get is like, oh, I don't have any Irish. And you can just tell by the way when the person says that, there's almost like this collapse of shame, of self-consciousness. And, I would say, oh, Tasha Carcalor, that's okay. So I'll just use what Irish I have, and I like to go back and forth between, Gaeilge agus Berla. So if they're, by the way, most people are going to have way better Irish than I have, but because I have the gra, I love the language. Tashi Gahalin Erfad. She is so beautiful.
It's remarkable, and I think you were saying earlier, Dian, that you said, oh well, I haven't kept up the study and so on, but you mentioned clack, and of course the challenge we face, I think, as Irish learners in Ireland is the lack of opportunity to actually practice and to use the language. It's so you're never going to face a problem in trying to use English around the place, in the Anglosphere across the Western world, but finding opportunities to use Irish and to practice in a way that you don't feel like you're imposing is always a challenge. And so, the fact that you're continuing to do so is inspirational. Can I just?
I suppose even on the bus, and there's this wonderful campaign running, at least in Dublin at the moment, from Transport for Ireland. And they brought it out for Seachtain na Gaeilge, Irish Language Week. But they have these billboards and they give you like a phrase in Irish, the pronunciation. And they're like, challenge number 1, say, Gamila Mahagut. But anyway, like when I get on the bus, if I'm not sure if the driver might speak Irish, by the way, that's hard to mix stereotypes around as well, because there are plenty of people of Asian descent now in Ireland or Indian descent who grew up here and they did just well with their Irish studies. So you can't really make an assumption here either. But I might say when I'm getting on the bus, Rinzan Leatherhull. And they usually get what I mean. If they don't, then I'll say please, but they understand the main element. When I get off the bus and everyone says thanks, I'll say Gamagat. The more you can bring the language in, even, again, that kuplafuckle, the few words, because here's the thing I want to say, I'm very passionate about this. Gandhi said, and this is my training in nonviolent communication, he was talking about peace, but be the change that you want to see in the world. No one's going to be speaking Irish in Dublin if no one is speaking Irish in Dublin, or anywhere in the country. And maybe it's easier because I'm a Yank and, I'm punk, and this is slang for Yank, I swear
but this is exactly what we need, I think, is because as you say, I think oftentimes the culture here is coming from inherited kind of tropes around, shame and things like that, where I think people don't want to and feel, I don't want to look stupid or whatever the case may be. So I think it's wonderful that we have just doing it. It's something fantastic. But I want to come into the Substack, Dean, because I think it's remarkable what you're doing.
One thing, sorry, it's really passionate for me when you mentioned the word shame. In my opinion, the Irish have nothing to be ashamed about. This is the most beautiful country, beautiful culture, generous people. And I know there's always exceptions. I don't want to and I know there's also a dark history in Ireland with institutional abuse. I don't mean to put rose-colored glasses. But there is such richness in this culture. And a lot of the shame that the Irish are carrying is because of this internalized colonialism. And I'm hoping with time, and I think it is happening, it can be let go of and shaken off. But the Irish have nothing to be ashamed of, in my opinion. I felt like starting in the 1980s when I first lived here, I almost felt like I was sent here to be like a PR campaign for Ireland and Irish culture to the Irish people. Because at the time, because the economy was so depressed and so many people were leaving, the Irish were especially hard on themselves. At least now, that the economy is in a different position. Ireland played in the World Cup, but I don't need to be. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but when you look at the performers that are known on an international level, coming up to the Oscars, right? We all know who's going to win the Oscars, right? For Hamlet. It took 3 Irish people to make the most important movie about Shakespeare. The author from Northern Ireland, as you probably know, and then the 2 lead actors. But anyway, the Irish have nothing to be ashamed about.
There's so much in that, I think, actually, in terms of Shakespearean English. But Dean, I want to just come into the Gaelic, the Gaelic effect and what you're doing there on Substack, because I think it's just remarkable. It's very, very cool. You have, I think, 3,500 subscribers there, and you've obviously spent this huge amount of time curating an incredible resource for anybody who can just go over and check you out there on Substack, the Gaelic Effect. But you subtitled the publication "How the Irish Language Can Save the World." And it's funny. We're here now. We're into season 2 of the podcast here, and as I was kind of getting ready for season 2 and kind of, if you like, getting the momentum of the podcast back again, I went back over some of the feedback I'd had from listeners over the years. And I want to just give a shout out, I hope he is still listening to the show, from Tom in North Carolina. And he mentioned a book to me, which I had never heard of, called Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. And I just was curious, was there any connection in that title?
Well, that's new for me. I want to go look for that book,
Okay.
Because, I'm going to write that down. It just came to me because it's true. And I stand behind it. And I know it sounds outrageous to a lot of people. But there is, I firmly believe that anyone who starts learning Irish, really learning it, and what I mean by really learning it is push through your initial defenses. If you think this is too weird, this is too different, yes, it's very different from English. It's very different from most of the European languages, in my opinion. Not that I speak them all, but that's from a linguistic point of view, from my understanding. Push through your initial defenses. If you do, I am convinced that you will fall in love with this language. Because again, it's such an amazing, beautiful language. And in terms of why I called it that subtitle, how the Irish language can save the world, is, and again, I bring my own experience here, my own personal history, but I grew up really with my own level of shame, being a U.S. citizen, looking at the history of slavery, looking at the history of how Indigenous people were treated in the United States, looking how the United States was treating Vietnam. You know, I grew up during that, or it was really the end of Vietnam, but it was close enough that I knew about it. And like, it just seemed like the Western world as a whole was just doing horrendous things. You look at the history of colonialism, to so many other parts of the world, imperialism. And when I started learning Irish, and especially having this background in studying colonialism and the impact of colonialism on a culture, I became convinced very quickly that British imperialism made such an effort to destroy the Irish language, not just as a way to oppress the Irish people, but because I actually think there are inherent aspects of the Irish language that directly challenges imperialistic thinking. The language itself was a threat to their whole way of seeing the world. I mean, I mentioned earlier about the way you say have usually in Irish is to use the verb at you. Like, that's amazing in itself. Like, you don't really have something in Irish. One of my blogs was about how it's a living world. Like, the main thing, from an Irish language point of view, the main thing I focus on is that you start with the verb. How would the world be different? Think about, like, in English, I did this, he did that. It's all about the agent who did something to someone else with that direct object. Irish, the world is alive. You start with what's happening. That's more important than who's doing it.
Yeah, and that whole because the whole way in which possession is kind of articulated in Irish is really fundamentally different. There's very few direct ways of stating it. Yeah,
it's all in effect kind of highly relational and intrinsically temporary. So this is like part of, if something is at you, you don't own it, you don't possess it in the same way. Now, by the way, I know I've been kind of, to use language of nonviolent communication, making an enemy image a bit of the English language. I mean, I still love English. It is my first language. So much of my world, obviously, I experience through English. But it is eye-opening, because what I do in the blog, as you know, I do a deep dive in the Irish language, but as a contrast, I look at English words. A lot of these, I didn't even know the etymology of myself. It's shocking. Like, one of the blogs I write about how it's so beautiful and touching for me in Irish. It's so egalitarian, the way you say husband and wife. Far Kayla, it's the man together. In effect, it's the man that I'm with. Or bad Kayla, it's the woman I'm with. And the way you say mother-in-law, it's the mother I'm with. So it's not mother-in-law through legal stuff. It's who I'm in relation with. If you look up the etymology of husband and wife in English, feckin' scary. Has to do with property, ownership, husbandry, nothing to do with relationality, nothing. And so much of the English language, I am sad to say, and by the way, I've said this in the blog, I can't make this up. When I spend hours, like I've told people, I spend on average 25 hours writing each Gaelic effect, which I know sounds extreme, but it's not the writing, it's the research. I go and look up the etymology of all these words, how they were used. I go to folklore, IE, and look up, because that's important to me too. It's not just the definition of the word, it's the context, how it's used, and that just expands the meaning of it so much. But anyway, and I did a recent blog on how moving it is for me that in Irish, when you address someone in a letter, you say friend. But if you look up the history of dear, first of all, in British English, you hear it in Ireland as well, it means expensive. And it's like, well, where did that come from? Well, that was the original meaning coming from Germanic languages. Then it got transferred to people. But in a sense, you're commodifying a person. But if you look up the word, the etymology of kara or mohara, if you have the shevu in there, friend in Irish, it actually is a double meaning originally of relation. Like all of your friends were also relations. Like that is so beautiful. I looked up this week the original meaning of student in Irish, and I love how there's two different ways of saying student. Like there's dalti, but then there's mac lean, like student of learning for like a third level student. But the dalti one was also meant like if someone was a foster person, which is like there's a rich history of fostering in Ireland and Irish history. They talk about you needing a village. So it takes a village to raise a child. So if you look up the nuances of these words, the etymology, how they're used, their historical meaning, again, I get chills.
A unique kind of cultural context for all of it. I mean, what you mentioned there as we were speaking, Dean, about, because you're prolific blogging on the Gaelic effect. And I think it's a wonderful resource for learners. I mean, would you mind just giving listeners a little bit of an outline of what inspired you to create it and what you've got there? I mean, because I see you have the Gael stack is kind of a directory, I think, almost of everything kind of Irish on Substack and so on. Maybe you should give us an outline of, first of all, what motivated you to start that and what you're doing there.
Yeah, that's like a little side project because I'm just an academic geek at the end of the day, because I would come across other people, mostly at first people doing Substacks also in the Irish language, which is very exciting and meaningful for me because obviously I have the love of the language. But then I was curious, who else is out here? So I just started researching and like just using the search engine to put in anything that could possibly, Ireland, Irish, Celtic, Gael, to see who's there. So I put this list together. Now, by the way, and this is what research always involves, when you put words like that in the search engine, you also get people that they have maybe Irish girl as their name, but they're of Irish descent, but their Substack really is not focused on Ireland or Irish studies at all. By the way, I'm going to say this now, it holds me accountable to it. Next year, I'm going to have a separate section for people living in Ireland writing a Substack who aren't writing specifically about Irish topics, because it's really hard. So often a Substack writer will contact me and say, look, I live in Connemara or wherever they are. My Substack isn't specifically about Ireland and Irish studies, but would you include me? And I'm just like, actually, no, because the criteria is that you are writing specifically, regularly about Irish language, history, or culture. You could be someone obviously living in Ireland writing about IT and not bringing in any Irish topics. You are not on that list then. So it's specifically Irish studies. But then I felt a little sad, thinking about, because I call it the clachan, but it's like the village on Substack. And I want to include people, but I also want to keep the integrity of Irish studies. So next year, that's a whole other project now, because I eliminated all those people until now, because they weren't in the criteria. But so next year, because each year I issued it last year, so I updated each year. If anyone hasn't published in the last 3 months, they get moved to an archive, in a history archive. So I want people to see current publishers on Irish subject matter. So that's a side thing. What the Gaelic effect is really about is how the Irish language can reconnect us. And I was talking to this earlier. My self-conscious and shame as someone of a Western European background, all of the travesty that Western European countries have created in the world for decades or hundreds of years. And then to discover, having had some experience and contact with indigenous practices in the United States, not a lot, I don't want to overstate that. I actually have a friend who's 1/8 First Nation. I am not. I'm 100% European mutt, okay? But the point is, I studied a little bit about indigenous cultures in the United States, in Turtle Island, as many First Nations refer to North America. And learning Irish blew me away. It's like, oh my God, there's so many similarities. And Ireland is not, like, by the UN or UNESCO considered an indigenous culture or country, but it is uncanny, and actually ManCon talks about this as well, how much is consistent with the Irish language. And so that opened up this whole world. And I had read books as an NVC trainer, like The Chalice and the Blade. And again, I talk about this in an earlier blog, how there's this like cliche idea that human beings have always been aggressive. We lived in a cave, we had the club, we were always fighting each other. A lot of archaeological evidence and history is showing now that it's simply untrue. And you can tell by looking at grave sites and what's buried in the grave site. Are they buried with spears and arrowheads, or are they buried with bowls? And you can read a lot into how people are buried, for example, when they do excavations of what's in a house, where houses, villages were located. There's a book I highly recommend, I often quote in The Gaelic Effect, The Chalice and the Blade by Rianne Eisler. And that book came out about 20 years ago, maybe a bit longer, even 25 years ago. But the point is, she collects all this research about new studies that are showing how human beings lived. So for me, I want us of European descent to realize we have a different history and a different possibility as human beings. We don't have to be tied to this quite horrific history, I think, of Western Europe. I mean, think what happened in the Second World War. Look what's happening now, you know?
Yeah. No, it's remarkable. I was just reading about this actually recently, and that whole the whole premise of Western civilization is on kind of, Hume and Locke and the social contract, and that everything before that was kind of, short, nasty, and brutish, or whatever it was. The idea that the primitive, lifestyle must have been brutal and violent, and civilization then brought what they called, the civilized kind of society. But of course, we know from indigenous cultures that's based on a fallacy. But what you're doing there, I think it's really, really fascinating. Can you tell us, Dean? I mean, because you can see this from the inside, and I'd love to just get a sense of it. I mean, what does that community look like? Who are the people that you kind of interact with in the Gaelic Effect? I mean, what does that community look like? Who are you dealing with? People who are of Irish descent abroad, Irish people living here directly? Give us a sense of what the community looks like.
That's an interesting question. I don't have the knowledge on me, which is another, by the way, beautiful structure in Irish. Again, you don't know something, which sounds so definitive. I haven't seen it, and maybe I need to dig deeper for it. Turtle Island, but not exclusively. A lot of them are Irish language learners. I know that because I often early on, especially people were saying, how do you pronounce that? And I decided, just because my blog's are already quite long, and Substack, if you get to a certain length, gives you this message saying you've reached the limit for an email for the length. And then, as I know, there's different dialects of Irish, and Munster Irish would be very different from Leinster or Ulster. I often just give a link where people can look the pronunciation of themselves, Changlin, you click over, you can get the pronunciation. It gives you by dialect, there's a little map of Ireland. So the point is, people can look that up and then really learn the dialect that they want. So I know from people asking for that some people are definitely learning the language. But some of them, I think, are just interested in Irish culture, and some of them, I think, are just inspired by the broader concepts. One of my biggest fans, who is a friend, by the way, I mean, for years, but she has no interest in Irish culture or connection to Irish culture other than knowing me and not learning Irish at all. But she frequently comments about, like, wow, that is a great concept. And when I wrote recently about this idea of friendship in Irish culture, and also this concept of looks, which I find really interesting, a group of people who have a similar interest. And for me, that's very different. Like I talked about in the blog, how the closest we approach that in English is to add ER onto a word. Like you take research, becomes a researcher. That's a group of people who do research. But look, like so much in Irish, has a very different connotation and quality to it. And it's beautiful that you can look shul. I hope I'm pronouncing this right, because again, I'm feeling self-conscious about my own here, but a little Irish. But that literally means the people who walk, and that's one way to refer to the traveler community in Ireland. She responds to that and said, like, I found out that there's a phrase in Irish that literally means the people who frequently visit other people's houses. And again, like, whoa, like what a pinhole in Indigenous Irish culture. Like you need a whole sentence to explain that. Also in the English to try to explain the mehel. The mehel, like, yes, you like the Amish sort of have something similar, but in Irish, there's one word that explains this whole cultural phenomenon that does not exist in English language culture. But also this idea of people who frequent other people's houses. For me, that brought in, I said this in the blog, this whole idea of the clachan, this cottages clustered together. And by the way, to protect each other, there's that lovely shanachal about we're each in each other's shadow. Those little cottages were sheltering each other from the weather. I talk about that in a blog as well. One of many things that the British colonial project criticized the Irish for. And they said, oh, look at how they do their villages. They're like higgledy-piggledy. No. That was like indigenous knowledge. They knew from hundreds and thousands of years that if you position this cottage this way, when the wind is blowing, they're going to protect each other. Again, that is so beautiful. But coming in from this dominant culture, looking for a way to oppress the Irish, oh, you're disorganized. That was one of the ways that the British project put down the Irish. No, the Irish weren't disorganized at all. It had a different cultural value. We don't need to put things in straight lines and in boxes. We need to arrange our houses so that we're protected from the weather and we're protecting each other, because we know, as the Chronicle tells us, that we live in each other's shadows. Like, this is deep.
That is so cool. That is so cool. Again, Afhara, just as we approach now, just the top of the hour, and as we need to wrap the show, the final question that I have for all guests is really just around your Irish language. Why? What motivates you in relation to language? I mean, you spend a huge amount of time creating and curating your Substack and the various resources there. Why do you do all that? And what's your Irish language way?
Well, my main reason for writing The Gaelic Effect, and I talk about this in the early blogs, is I was really suffering from everything I was seeing happening in the world. I found it very heavy. And this is even before it's happening now. Like, Jesus, can it get any worse? Sorry. I don't want to jinx that, but it just seems like just when we think things are, one travesty goes to the next. But even 3 or 4 years ago, I was very down about what's happening in the world. And so for me, learning Irish gives me hope. It gives me a possibility of what is possible for us as human beings. If we can remember what we're capable of. And the Irish in this regard have a huge amount to offer the rest of the world. And I believe that the Irish language is like a heritage seed. It holds in it this rich knowledge and culture that, yes, I'm sad to say, change is complex. I have a friend who always slides me. He's like, no, Dian, don't be projecting on the 1980s. And if you look at, some films about the 1980s, it looks really grim. Honestly, I don't remember being that grim. Maybe I had my own little pocket in here in Dublin. Again, I don't want to put things in rose-colored glasses. But this is a long way of saying some things are lost and some things are gained. I can even see in the course of my lifetime how a lot of Irish culture is further being lost. That indigenous culture, which is just the nature of the world with the internet and travel. But there's some great things that come out of that as well. It's not all, quote, bad, but I see that loss. And when I was living in the 80s, I was going to the UCD folk archives and reading there about, they could see how much was lost with the invention of television. How much has now been lost now with the internet, which again has other wonderful things about it. Like Substack, I don't want to demonize these things, but there is also a loss. But how can we reconnect and remember? And I think as a heritage seed, the Irish language offers Irish people a connection to your culture. I am a guest of the nation, so to speak, if that's a reference. But anyway, not that kind of guest, but still, I'm still a guest of the nation. But it can inspire the world. But I think as far-right, Stephen Bannon said a few months ago that he wants to make Ireland conservative. There are conservative think tanks putting money into Ireland to try to get Ireland to become conservative in certain ways and reactionary. Personally, I don't think that's true to Irish culture. And how do I know that? From studying the Irish language, because that is that heritage seed.
Well, the heritage seed, that is such a beautiful image for us to bring this conversation together on. Again, Achara Gurav Mila Mahagut, when it's on sopa sunish gale, Orion Tooling, Berbua, August Banat.
Oh, good Mila Mahagut.
Thanks for listening. Gurav Mila Mahagut Asave Eishtucht. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources
and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests, and to receive exclusive content.
Slán